It's easy to get lost. This is The Revenue Maze, and I'm Valerie Cobb. Join me as we navigate the halls, dead ends, and U-turns on your path towards upward growth trajectory. The Revenue Maze is sponsored by Revenue North Star, guidance and execution through fractional revenue leadership, uncovering hidden revenues, and empowering small business growth through process-driven sales customized to your company environment. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Revenue Maze. I'm super excited about today's guest. He has made it his mission to build an action-based ecosystem. Probably some of his roots stemming from some of his roots of being in purgatory from finance on the East Coast. I have been super excited about talking about him being from Maine and Colorado and loving the outdoors, and we'll get into that just a little bit later. He has started a company that is in the food and beverage strategy at Rodeo CPG. Welcome, CEO and founder, Zachary DeAngelo. Zach, welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Great to be here.
Before we get into all the fun, exciting things about Maine, Colorado, purgatory of finance, and all this stuff that brought you to Rodeo CPG, we always answer one question in this show.
Sure.
What is one thing that you can do to help the listeners get out of the revenue maze?
Yeah, and it's a great question right now. I think it's incredibly pertinent, particularly in this sort of what's going on in the world and how that translates to small business and investors and all of that. And I think that the one piece of advice is to clearly define what your goals for success with your business are very early on. And then being willing to be flexible around that in order to create and generate momentum for the long haul. And I think that part of that is getting a clear understanding of how and when you can become profitable and create a really solid business that actually generates positive cash flow. And that is something that some brands or companies had not been able to do up to this point. And in times like this, that becomes really, really hard for people to figure it out on the fly. So that's the initial talking point that I'd say.
Well, that is a lot to unpack. A lot of the listeners, we talk about this all the time, that 99% of the businesses in the US and the UK are small businesses. And the number one reason for failure is due to cash flow. So I love that you talk about goals. And making sure that you're having that end goal in mind to keep the momentum going and all that kind of stuff. So could you do us a favor, though? That is a lot. So give us like 3 pointers. I mean, you're successful. We all need those pointers. That's why I love doing this podcast. I get great pointers for myself as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, success is sort of it's a general thing that to me is a moving target, and success for one person might look very different for another, and all of that translates to what strategy you're trying to build out for your company. And an example is if you want to start a company that is scales to $150 million in the food and bev space, you have to be sure that you have a pretty robust investing strategy plus a product that is really sort of I guess ideal for a very, very large demographic versus a niche product, which means the price point has to be pretty low, which means your COGS have to be pretty low. So that's one strategy. Or if you're a small business that just wants to grow a really beautiful niche product that is more suitable for a very small audience, then you probably wouldn't have to raise a lot of money. You have to be mindful of your cash flow, and it's just in a different hiring strategy and all of it. But all of those components of a business need to align with that strategy. So that's again, easier said than done, but it is, a lot of people just go into it without really thinking about what they want out of the business and what is meaningful to them and what would constitute success in their mind, in 3 or 5 years or whatever the time frame it is.
Yeah, I love that. I think you and I have both been in some similar spaces. I haven't been in the food and beverage industry, so I'm not going to say that I've been in that space, but in the kind of revenue space in the past, where it's kind of the whole. I've used this on the show before. It's the Alice in Wonderland thing and the Cheshire Cat, and she's asking, "Well, where do I go?" And he goes, "Well, where do you want to go? Because then it doesn't matter where you go if you don't know what and obviously that's a clunky summary of it, but at the end of the day what you're saying is really it depends, and you've got to define all of that, right?
Yeah.
You've got to define where you want to be and then work backwards. That builds the teams, that builds the who are we targeting? Like, what you run up against this all the time. A salesman is supposed to be hired. Okay, well, what is my target? How do I get there? What am I doing? Right. And a lot of times you run into these smaller businesses or a lot of these startups or, and it's not well defined. They have like five steps for a go-to-market strategy because everybody says keep it simple, but it is simple. You've got to give it to a team in simplicity. But when you're trying to bake out something 5 years in the future, I don't feel like there's much simple about that, right? I mean, there's a strategy behind it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. But, a lot of times you can sort of assert guardrails and parameters based on pretty back of the napkin math, knowing that, like, if you're, and again, a lot of my context is going to come from the food and bev perspective, but if you know that your product is a sauce that costs $10 and velocities at stores are below 1 unit per store per SKU per week,
Yeah.
if you like have in your mind that you're going to create $100 million business, I can very quickly show you that that's not possible with, with those low velocities, with that high price point, with, a presumed smaller audience. And there are a lot of analogs to that very simple math that people can figure out. And that's not to say that you can plan explicitly what's going to happen over the next 5 years, because you can't. But just being like, is this rational? And is there a logical hypothesis for this to happen? That's all I'm really talking about. It's not like, creating the entire vision all at once. Because the other, piece of advice for an entrepreneur or founder or anyone really is, there is always going to be a high element of unpredictability. So you're going to have to pivot and keep pivoting. And, the most successful companies are just really good at shifting and changing and adapting, because almost no one gets it right at the beginning. But yeah, it's a no matter what, sort of a drunkard's walk, where you just think you're going one way, then you don't, and then you got to go the other way. You just have to be up for that.
Yeah. I love the back of the napkin analogy.
I mean,
It
a
is
lot
simple
of the
math, but you run into people who are going, I just don't know where to go. So anyways, that's one, I think that's been one of the biggest challenges, is to say, well, theoretically, where can I go?
Mhm.
And it's a simple question, but it took me, gosh, I don't know, for just to create my why in business, it's taken me 20 years. I mean, I'm just like, and that's just because, like you said, adapting, things change, but that came from a Vistage leader. But we're not going to get into me right now. What we're going to do is talk about some of the back of the napkin stuff and what you're doing today to help those that are, you built obviously Rodeo CPG based on some of this framework that you're talking about, right? And so I'd love to hear not how you kind of came to it, a little bit of your story of why did you start building this? I mean, that what
Yeah.
did you find in the marketplace? What was going
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, so I mean, my background, as you said, I always say, I spent some purgatory in finance. I was pricing credit default swaps in 2006 in New York, and that was a crazy time. And ultimately, I just didn't enjoy it. I always loved food, so I went to graduate school in the hopes of figuring out what a career in food meant, and ended up starting a gluten-free cereal company with a partner that had celiac, and that was called Coco Mama Foods, and traveled around the country in various co-manufacturing facilities, learning the operational side of the business. And along the way, met a friend who had started a baby food company. So I joined him in that effort, and we grew Little Duck Organics to about 20,000 doors across the country, and ended up selling the business in 2014. I moved from New York to Colorado and ran sales for a natural pet food company called I Am Loving You. So had these various brand experiences, and had always kind of been disappointed by the services infrastructure in food and beverage. There was like, the experts, the advisors, there wasn't a lot of innovation in that support network, not a lot of data, not a lot of technology. So, I started Rodeo to try to build that better operational model to help, many brands grow more quickly and more efficiently. So that was how I got there. And then over the past 6 years now, we've been building the team, and functionally, we help all sorts of companies in three areas: operations, product development, and sales management. So those three things allow us to help brands in sort of an integrated way, and help them navigate the crazy world of retail and DTC and all of those things that apply to my industry. So that's kind of where I came from, the need that I saw, and kind of where we're going. And the fun part for me now is building software to try to address some of these problems at much greater scale. So we're in the midst of that as well.
Oh, it sounds exciting. Yeah, I could see how that was definitely a need in the industry. So when we talk about that and how you got there, there's a backstory even further back in your history. You talked about finance, you talked about some of those things, but didn't you say you had a mother that was in catering and that kind of sparked? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, my mom always owned a catering company as a kid, and ran the company out of our, we had a commercial kitchen in our house since I was little. So there were always cooks and chefs and things going around, and I was always in the kitchen. So learning to cook was always, happened at a very early age. So, and then as I grew up, just my appreciation for food never went away. I would always spend my last dollar on a great meal. That's still what drives me when I travel and all of those things. So food is very much a part of my life in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about kind of some of the formative years with that. So if you had advice, I love this type of thing. If you could tell your younger self, now that you're older, wiser, right? What is one thing that you would tell yourself to do, differently?
Yeah, I think that for me, like a lot of the intermediary steps were important to ultimately figure it out. So I don't, that question's a little hard for me, because I do believe that a lot of the trials and the failures and the successes all wrap up into who you want to be. I there are certain things, like in college and high school, I wish I had been a little bit more dedicated, and I wish I had figured out what my passions were earlier on. But that's that, and then going for it, and realizing that the biggest impediment to entrepreneurship or anything really is that people have, I think, a tendency to be like, that's too hard, or I can't, or I don't know even where to start. And there we really do have the capacity to learn most things and figure it out. And it took me a while to, I guess, unleash my own realization or capacity in that way. And if my earlier self could could grasp that, then that would have been wonderful. But since I didn't, that's okay too.
I know it's a bit of a hard question because that is who we become, right? I mean, it's like, well, if you take, so I'm a big science fiction person. So if you take one thing out of the future, one thing out of the past, it totally alters the future, right? And someone brought up a good topic over the weekend, and it was why do bad things happen to good people? Now, this was an interesting, what do you say, perspective on it. And his perspective was, well, define bad. Just
Yeah.
because something is hard doesn't mean it was bad or wrong, right? And like you said, if there's successes and failures, well, those failures are things that, are they really failures, or were they things that mold us into our learning journey? I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm not that not that good at it, but I
Well, I get
totally
you.
get what you're saying. You got to where you are because of those life experiences. So you would probably, for me, I answer that question, I would probably enjoy the journey a little bit more for me, right? That's one of the things, because I'm a very I get very focused in tunnel vision, and I look back and go, wow, that was a great experience. But in the middle of it, I wasn't enjoying the journey all the time. So
Well, I think a lot of us have that issue. And, I think that there are always going to be a lot of things outside of our control. And while we don't control those things, we do control how we react to them. So, I think that, and now is a good time to recognize that, because now, at least in my industry, and I think it's going to be a bunch of industries, this is not an easy time. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and investors are getting a little spooked. The markets have obviously taken a hit. There are a lot of exogenous factors, wars, shortages, price hikes, inflation, a lot of it. And the ability to fight through that and recognize that it is hard and there's no way it's not going to be hard, but that's part of it. I think is an important perspective to have, especially if you're a small business owner or entrepreneur.
well, when we talk about some of those things, because recession, I was in no, it wasn't. It was Great Game of Business, which is a methodology as well. Jack Stack, those guys. They always said there isn't a recession if you prep for it. Even in depression, there were lines of businesses that were excelling, right? So as we talk about some of that pivoting that you're talking about, that takes a lot of what I think emotional fortuity, stamina. Yeah. Because I'll use a little bit of analogy. One time I was working with a sales team and they were in manufacturing, and they were really down against, operations doesn't like us. We always hear that revenue against operations, that whole, you know, and, um, and so we sent out a company survey, and I remember talking to the CFO and saying, sales really has this extremely downtrodden look at what operations thinks of them, and it's kind of, you'll hear that all the time. I heard it yesterday with one of my clients, and we were talking, and this CFO said something that was so important to me, especially during this time. And there was a post on LinkedIn yesterday that was also very, very relevant. So he said, they're not looking at the data. They're doing everything from emotion, right? And so when we got the surveys back, I went into the sales meeting with all of them and counted the times that they had complimented sales. And it was, the whole demeanor of the group was totally changed. Oh, they don't, one person said one thing, and it's that whole 1 against 10, right? And so in the recession portion of it, when we start thinking about that, we're actually only 2 markers, apparently. I'm not an economist, and so I play one, or I quote a lot of people, but the reality is there was only two markers that really say recession, and everybody's all worried right now about a recession. And yeah, there's a war going on, there's all these things. In my years, there's always been something going on, and it never changes, right? There's always something somewhere going on that is not ideal, so to speak. And I love how you talked about pivoting, because that speaks to your stamina, your emotional stamina, right? It is what you need to do while you're going into the future for it.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, you're right. It's not easy for us emotionally to set a strategy and then have to recognize that we were incorrect, and we have to move to a different strategy with the same enthusiasm and energy. It's even more hard to do that in an organization where you're getting a bunch of people to do that.
Mhm.
But if you're used to it and you practice, it becomes less of a emotional slog and much more of just a exercise in execution. So it's just great. Like, I'm not emotionally attached to that thing. It was a hypothesis that we made. The hypothesis was incorrect. So we're going to readjust and create a new hypothesis and work against that and measure it and rinse and repeat. So that to me is very applicable in my business. It's very applicable to the businesses that we help. And I'm assuming small business at large. Obviously, as you become bigger and bigger and bigger, that becomes hard because you've made capital investments, you've made human, personnel investments, you've made all sorts of things that, the larger you are, the harder it is to, move the ship, as it were. But that's why small business has such an advantage, is that we are not constrained by and large by those huge capital investments.
Yeah. And it's the birthplace of some of the new lines of business because they can pivot.
Mm-hmm.
Small businesses can pivot very fast. But so as you talked about that pivoting in your organization, what I liked is you said, I'm not attached. It was a hypothesis. Now we're moving.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an emotional attachment. And I find that exactly what that CFO was doing, is saying it's not an emotional attachment, right? You need to see the numbers. You need to change what you're thinking because it's not real. It's kind of what I term the matrix effect, in the Matrix, in the movie, where they realize that it's not real, and it's all this mind-blowing stuff. So I like that a lot, Zach. So people want to know what you like to do in your free time, because right now you're building, obviously, your company,
Mm-hmm.
and you're working through the dynamics of everything else that's going on with that. But what do you like to do? What are you passionate about?
Yeah, so as you sort of mentioned, being outdoors is important to my wife, myself, our family. We're constantly biking in the summer, mountain biking, road biking. We're swimming and playing tennis and all of those things, staying active, which I think is really important for us mentally, and probably a lot of people mentally, especially if you're sort of in a high stress environment. And then in the winter we're skiing, and so it's all, for us, or if I were to distill it down, for us it's outdoors, it's exercise, it's reading, it's traveling and eating. Like, that's not that complicated.
Well, it sounds like a heck of a lot of fun. And I didn't know you were a tennis player. I'm a tennis player too.
Nice.
We may have talked about that before and I've just forgotten. Forgive me, but yeah. So who's your favorite player right now?
Oh, well, it's funny. I don't watch a ton of sports. Nadal's great. Djokovic is a good villain to have, but also incredibly talented. I think in tennis, some of the players now are some of the best that we've seen ever, and it's been remarkable how long those careers have been between Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, all those guys. So it's a fun time. I'm sure that there are some new upstarts that I don't know about, but yeah, I do much more playing than I do watching.
I'm actually very much the same way. I'll go and play any sport, but I don't love watching it. But I do love watching the opens.
Yeah.
And and there's a lot of reasons why I like Federer as well. Just that's a whole nother story. But yeah, no, that's awesome. And then I hear that you have a beautiful son.
Yeah, our son Van is just about to be a 2 in October, so that's been a fun journey, and in some ways the shift toward remote and all of that. Rodeo's always been remote, so that wasn't much of a transition for us, but just by and large, it's been a time where we've spent more time, I think, with our son than we otherwise would have. So that's one silver lining to the past crazy couple years.
All right, one last question. Well, there's never one last question, but one more question. If you had a mentor, who would that be?
Yeah, I have lots of mentors. I mean, I think that we seek mentors within our own family. So I have, my parents, my aunts and uncles have all, been impactful in how I see the world and how what I aspire to be and the business that I want to create. There are mentors in sports, as you know, that I have. Again, someone like Federer or Serena Williams or someone like that that's been able to, uh, I guess, compete at a high level for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's really great. I think in business, people like Richard Branson are just men, or I guess people I look up to. Someone who can have a ton of fun, maintain huge businesses, and also preserve a family life. It's things like that I look toward in terms of mentorship.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Oh, okay. So this really is the last question. All right. People want to know about you and they want to know about Rodeo CPG and all of those things. How do they get a hold of you?
Super easy. So there's a million forms on our website that you can contact. My personal email is just Zachary, Zachary at rodeocpg.com. And I'm always available on LinkedIn. We generate a lot of content there. So they're very accessible. So if it's a question or is interested in learning more, I'm very available.
Oh, perfect. Well, Zach, thank you so very much for being on this show. And I want to thank all those who are listening to the Revenue Maze. It has been another fantastic show. I again, thank you all. If you loved it, liked it, comment, all those things. Let's show Zach and his company some love there. And again, thank you, Zach, for being on the show.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It was a good time.
Thank you all for joining another great episode. For show notes, links, and resources, visit revenuemaze.com. And never forget, you are why.